Bless her heart, she's barely getting by. I saw her at the Goodwill last week buying clothes, and her car has to be at least 15 years old," Mrs. Davidson announced to the women's ministry circle, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and satisfaction that only church ladies can perfect. "We really should organize a food drive or maybe a clothing collection. It's our Christian duty to help the less fortunate among us, even when they're too proud to ask." The 7 other women nodded in solemn agreement while I sat 3 rows behind them in the sanctuary, having arrived early for choir practice and apparently invisible to everyone discussing my supposedly desperate circumstances. But why did I simply bow my head and smile instead of correcting their assumptions? And why, exactly 2 weeks later at an emergency congregational meeting, did Mrs. Davidson's face drain of all color when Pastor Williams revealed exactly who had funded every major project at Grace Community Church for the past 5 years? The sanctuary was fuller than I'd ever seen it for a non-Sunday gathering. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, his expression carrying the weight of someone about to deliver news that would reshape how this congregation understood itself. "I've called this meeting because there's been a significant misunderstanding in our community, one that speaks to how we see each other and how badly we can misjudge." Mrs. Davidson sat in her usual spot in the 3rd pew, surrounded by her women's ministry circle, all of them wearing expressions of anticipatory concern. They'd spent 2 weeks organizing what they called Operation Blessing, a coordinated effort to provide financial assistance to the struggling single mother they'd identified as being in desperate need. That struggling single mother was me, and I was about to become someone they'd never expected. My name is Adaeze Oyelaren, though most people at Grace Community Church knew me simply as Ada. I joined the congregation 6 years ago, shortly after moving to Traverse City, Michigan, a decision that had puzzled everyone who knew me. Why would a successful forensic accountant leave a prestigious position at a Chicago firm to relocate to a small city on the shores of Grand Traverse Bay? The answer was complicated, rooted in loss and the need for reinvention. My husband, Chukwemeka, had died 3 years before the move, a brain aneurysm that had taken him between breakfast and lunch on an ordinary Tuesday. One moment, he was complaining about the Cubs' pitching rotation. The next moment, I was a widow at 34, with a 7-year-old daughter and a life that no longer made sense. The Chicago firm had been his world more than mine. The apartment had been our shared space, every corner haunted by his absence. The city itself had become a geography of grief. Traverse City offered something different. Cherry orchards instead of skyscrapers, the vast blue expanse of Lake Michigan instead of concrete canyons, a pace of life that allowed for healing rather than just endurance. I'd arrived with my daughter Chiamaka, a substantial inheritance I'd never touched, and the remote consulting practice I'd built while grieving, a practice that had somehow grown into something worth more than I'd ever imagined. The assumptions about my financial situation had started almost immediately. I drove a 2009 Honda Accord, Chukwemeka's car, the last thing his hands had touched before leaving for work that Tuesday morning. The thought of replacing it felt like erasing another piece of him. I shopped at Goodwill and Salvation Army stores, partly because sustainable fashion mattered to me, partly because the treasure hunt aspect delighted Chiamaka, and partly because I'd grown up in a household where thrift was a virtue, not a necessity. I lived in a modest rental house on 8th Street, a 3-bedroom bungalow that cost less per month than the parking space at my Chicago apartment had. I didn't discuss my work, my clients, or my income. When people asked what I did, I said, accounting work, and changed the subject. The specifics felt like bragging, and I'd been raised to believe that money was a private matter. To the church community, these details assembled into a portrait of poverty. A single black mother, an old car, secondhand clothes, a small rental. Working from home on accounting work that probably meant data entry or bookkeeping, they saw what they expected to see. The women's ministry had been watching me for months. Mrs. Davidson, Patricia Davidson, wife of the town's most successful real estate developer, had appointed herself my unofficial monitor. She noted what I wore to services, what I put in the collection plate, usually a sealed envelope, which she apparently assumed contained whatever small bills I could spare, what I drove, where I shopped. That poor woman, I'd overheard her saying more than once, raising that sweet daughter all alone, clearly stretched to the breaking point. The other women clucked sympathetically. I'd never corrected them. Partly because explaining my actual situation felt awkward, partly because their assumptions seemed harmless, and partly, if I'm being honest, because there was something fascinating about watching people construct an entire narrative about your life without ever asking you a single question. The Operation Blessing planning had happened at a women's ministry meeting I wasn't supposed to know about. But church buildings have thin walls and voices carry, especially when you're early for choir practice and sitting quietly in the sanctuary, reviewing financial documents on your laptop. "I've been doing some research," Mrs. Davidson had announced. "I found her on LinkedIn. She lists herself as a consultant, which we all know is code for unemployed. And I looked up her rental house. The landlord said she's never once been late on rent, but barely. He mentioned she asked about payment plans last winter. I had asked about payment plans, not because I couldn't afford rent, but because I was curious about the landlord's flexibility for a client who was struggling. I'd been considering buying and renovating the property as part of an affordable housing initiative." "The poor thing," another voice had murmured. "And that daughter of hers is so bright. Imagine what she could do with proper opportunities." Chiamaka was 12 now and attending a selective online academy that specialized in STEM education for gifted students. The tuition was $24,000 per year, which I paid annually in full. "I think we should organize something meaningful," Mrs. Davidson had continued. "Not just a one-time handout, a sustained effort, grocery gift cards every month, help with her car, maybe we can take up a collection for repairs, school supplies for Chiamaka." The plan had grown from there. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. These women, these well-meaning, genuinely concerned Christian women, wanted to help someone they perceived as struggling. Their impulse was charitable. Their hearts were, in their own way, in the right place. But they'd never asked me if I needed help. They'd never inquired about my actual circumstances. They'd constructed a narrative based on appearances and assumptions, then organized an elaborate intervention without consulting the subject of their concern. It was kindness without curiosity, charity without conversation, good intentions wrapped in the presumption that they understood my life better than I did. I'd decided to let the situation unfold naturally, not out of malice. I genuinely believed Mrs. Davidson meant well, even if her methods were condescending. But there was something instructive happening. Something that might benefit the entire congregation if it played out properly. Pastor Williams was the variable I couldn't control. He was relatively new to Grace Community, 3 years into his tenure, still learning the dynamics of a congregation that had been established for over a century. He was thoughtful, measured, and committed to transparency in church operations. When Mrs. Davidson had approached him about Operation Blessing, he'd asked a question that apparently hadn't occurred to anyone else. "Have you talked to Sister Ada about this? Asked her if she wants or needs assistance?" "Pastor, some people are too proud to ask for help. It's our duty to offer it regardless." "I appreciate that sentiment, but let me check some things first." The things he checked were the church's financial records. Grace Community Church had experienced a transformation over the past 5 years. The aging community center had been replaced with a modern facility featuring a full kitchen, meeting rooms, and a youth center. The sanctuary had been renovated. The parking lot had been repaved. A scholarship fund for local students had been established. A food pantry serving the broader community had been launched and fully stocked. All of these projects had been funded primarily by a single anonymous donor. The anonymous donor had requested complete confidentiality. The church board knew someone was giving generously. The treasurer processed the donations. But only Pastor Williams knew the identity of the benefactor. I'd wanted it that way. The giving wasn't about recognition. It was about purpose. Finding meaning in the resources I'd accumulated, honoring Chukwuemeka's memory through action rather than grief, building something lasting in the community that had welcomed Chiamaka and me when we needed a fresh start. Pastor Williams had called me 2 days before the congregational meeting. "Sister Ada, we need to talk about something delicate." "The Women's Ministries Assistance Program?" He'd paused. "You know about that?" "Church walls are thin, Pastor, and Mrs. Davidson has a carrying voice." "I see." Another pause. "May I ask why you haven't corrected their assumptions? Because they've never asked me anything directly. Everything they think they know about my situation comes from observation and speculation. I've been curious to see how far that would go before anyone thought to simply have a conversation with me." That's an interesting approach. I'm a forensic accountant, Pastor. I trace the stories people tell through the evidence they leave behind. Watching people construct a narrative from incomplete information is sort of my professional specialty. The conversation that followed had been more substantial than I'd expected. Pastor Williams had shared his concerns about the church culture, the tendency toward assumption, the well-meaning paternalism that sometimes infected charitable efforts, the way certain members positioned themselves as arbiters of who deserved help and how it should be delivered. Mrs. Davidson isn't a bad person, he'd said, but she has blind spots, significant ones. Most people do. True. But hers are affecting how this congregation treats its members. And I think there might be an opportunity here. A teaching moment, if you're willing. What did you have in mind? The truth, delivered in a way that might actually change how people think. The congregational meeting had been framed as a budget discussion. Pastor Williams had announced it as an opportunity to review the church's financial health and discuss upcoming projects. The timing coincided with the annual stewardship campaign, so no one suspected an ulterior motive. Mrs. Davidson had actually been pleased. She'd assumed the meeting would include recognition of the women's ministry's charitable efforts, a public launching of Operation Blessing that would cement her reputation as the congregation's leading benefactor. I sat in my usual spot, fourth row from the back, dressed in a vintage cardigan I'd found at the Salvation Army and a skirt Chiamaka had sewn herself in her fashion design class. I looked exactly like what Mrs. Davidson expected me to be. Pastor Williams began with the financial overview. Grace Community Church is in the strongest financial position in its 127-year history. Our operating fund is fully funded. Our building maintenance reserve exceeds recommendations. Our community programs are sustainable for the foreseeable future. The congregation murmured appreciatively. This health is not accidental. Over the past 5 years, this church has received $847,000 in designated gifts from various donors, large and small. Every one of those gifts has been a blessing. He paused. However, the single largest contributor to our transformation has been an anonymous donor who has given consistently and generously, asking for nothing in return except that their identity remain private. Mrs. Davidson nodded knowingly. She probably assumed the anonymous donor was one of the town's established wealthy families, perhaps the Hendersons or the Walters, old money that preferred discretion. This donor funded our community center renovation, $180,000. They funded the sanctuary improvements, $95,000. They established and continue to maintain our student scholarship fund, $67,000 to date. They underwrite our food pantry operations, approximately $42,000 annually. The numbers hung in the air. Until this week, only I knew who this donor was. The donor had requested complete confidentiality, and I honored that request absolutely. Pastor Williams looked directly at me. But circumstances have changed. The donor has agreed to be identified because there's something important this congregation needs to understand about how we see each other, and how badly we can be wrong. Mrs. Davidson's expression was beginning to shift from self-satisfied to uncertain. Earlier this month, our women's ministry began organizing a charitable effort they called Operation Blessing. The goal was to provide sustained financial assistance to a church member they believed was struggling, a single mother they'd identified as being in desperate need. A few people in the women's ministry circle exchanged uncomfortable glances. The member they identified was Sister Adias Oyelaran. Heads turned toward me. The women's ministry concluded based on observation that Sister Ada drives an old car, wears secondhand clothes, lives in a modest rental, and works from home doing what they assumed was low-paying accounting work. Pastor Williams' voice remained gentle but firm. They concluded she was barely getting by. They organized food drives and clothing collections. They discussed taking up offerings for her car repairs. They planned all of this without ever asking Sister Ada a single question about her actual circumstances. The silence in the sanctuary was complete. So let me share some facts that might be relevant. Sister Ada is not a bookkeeper working from home. She is one of the top forensic accountants in the Midwest. Her consulting practice, which she operates remotely from Traverse City, specializes in fraud investigation for corporate clients, law firms, and government agencies. Mrs. Davidson's face had gone pale. Her client list includes Fortune 500 companies, the FBI, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. She has served as an expert witness in 17 federal cases. Her hourly consulting rate is $650, and she typically bills 1,200 to 1,500 hours annually. I watched the math happening behind people's eyes. The old car she drives belonged to her late husband. She keeps it for sentimental reasons, not financial necessity. The secondhand clothes reflect her commitment to sustainable fashion and her upbringing in a household that valued thrift as a virtue. The modest rental she lives in, she's in negotiations to purchase and renovate the entire building as part of an affordable housing initiative she's developing. Pastor Williams turned to face the women's ministry section directly. And the anonymous donor who has given $847,000 to this church over the past 5 years? Who funded every major project you've benefited from? Who underwrites the food pantry that serves 200 families monthly? He paused. That donor is Sister Adayez Oyalaran. The woman you were planning to give food stamps and clothing donations to has given more to this church than your entire ministry has raised in a decade. The sanctuary erupted into murmuring. Mrs. Davidson sat frozen, her face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like anger. How? She started. How were we supposed to know? She never said anything. She never... You never asked, Pastor Williams interrupted gently. You observed. You assumed. You organized an entire charitable intervention without ever having a single conversation with the person you intended to help. But she looked like someone you expected to be struggling. A single black mother with an old car and secondhand clothes. You filled in the rest of the story based on your assumptions. Mrs. Davidson's husband, Richard, the real estate developer, had gone red in the face. Whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. This is humiliating, he said. You're publicly shaming my wife for trying to do a good thing. I'm publicly illustrating a pattern that has affected this congregation for years. The assumption that certain people need saving while others are above reproach. The charity that's extended without conversation. The way we construct stories about each other based on appearances and never bother to verify them. I stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. May I say something, Pastor? Of course, Sister Ada. I walked to the front of the sanctuary, aware of how I looked. The vintage cardigan, the handmade skirt, the practical shoes. The uniform of someone who didn't care about impressing anyone. Mrs. Davidson, I want to be clear about something. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you genuinely wanted to help someone you believed was struggling. That impulse is admirable. Mrs. Davidson blinked, apparently not expecting this framing. But there's a difference between charity and condescension. Between helping and assuming you know what someone needs without asking. Between seeing a person and seeing a category. I paused, gathering my thoughts. When I moved to Traverse City 6 years ago, I was struggling. But not financially. My husband had died suddenly. I was a widow at 34 with a daughter who had lost her father. I needed community, connection, purpose. Money was the least of my concerns. This church gave me some of what I needed. The choir, the fellowship dinners, the sense of belonging. But it also showed me patterns I recognized from my professional work. The way people construct narratives, fill in blanks, create stories that serve their own understanding of the world. I've been watching you for 6 years, I continued, not maliciously, professionally, observing how assumptions form, how they spread, how they become accepted truth without anyone questioning the original evidence. The women's ministry decided I was struggling because I drove an old car and wore secondhand clothes. But did anyone consider that I might have reasons for those choices that had nothing to do with poverty? Did anyone ask me about my work, my background, my circumstances? Did anyone think to simply have a conversation before organizing an intervention? Mrs. Davidson's voice was small. We were trying to be discreet. We didn't want to embarrass you. You embarrassed yourselves by assuming you understood my life better than I did. By treating charity as something you do to people rather than with them. By spending weeks organizing assistance for someone who didn't need it while there are undoubtedly people in this congregation who are actually struggling, but don't fit your image of what struggle looks like. The point landed visibly. Several people in the congregation shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing themselves in the description. I gave anonymously because I didn't want recognition. I wanted the giving to be about the work, not about me. But I also gave anonymously because I wanted to see something, Whether this congregation could accept that a black woman who drives an old car and shops at Goodwill might be the one doing the giving, not the one needing to receive. The answer, apparently, is no. 6 years of substantial giving, and the moment a group of church ladies decided to pay attention to me, they concluded I was a charity case. That's not a failure of individuals. It's a failure of imagination. A failure to consider that appearances might be deceiving, that assumptions might be wrong, that the person in the secondhand cardigan might have a more complicated story than you've bothered to learn. Pastor Williams stepped forward. I want to be clear about why we're having this conversation publicly. It's not to humiliate anyone. It's because patterns like this don't change through private corrections. They change when a community collectively recognizes what it's been doing and decides to do differently. Mrs. Davidson, your women's ministry does important work. But that work needs to be grounded in relationship, not assumption, in conversation, not observation, in asking people what they need, not deciding for them. Mrs. Davidson nodded slowly, her composure beginning to reassemble itself. Whatever her flaws, she wasn't stupid. She could see the writing on the wall. I owe Sister Ada an apology, she said carefully. A significant one. What I organized was presumptuous at best and insulting at worst. I accept your apology, I said, but I also have a suggestion. The suggestion had been forming in my mind for weeks. The impulse behind Operation Blessing wasn't wrong. There are people in this community who need help, genuine help, offered with dignity and respect. What if we channeled that energy into something that actually works? I'm proposing a new ministry, not charity as usual, but something different. A mutual aid network where people can request help privately, where assistance is offered without judgment, where the goal is partnership rather than rescue. I'll fund the initial operations, $50,000 to start. But the structure matters more than the money. Every request for help must begin with a conversation. Every offer of assistance must be based on what someone actually needs, not what we assume they need. Every interaction must be rooted in dignity. I turned to Mrs. Davidson. Patricia, I think you should lead it. The offer was genuine. Mrs. Davidson, for all her flaws, was an organizer. She could mobilize people, coordinate logistics, get things done. Her blind spots were real, but they were also correctable, if she was willing to learn. Me? She looked genuinely surprised. Especially after everything you did. You understand now, in a way you didn't before, how assumptions can mislead us. That understanding is valuable. Use it. I don't know what to say. Say you'll try. Say you'll build something that helps people without diminishing them. Say you'll ask questions before organizing interventions. Mrs. Davidson's husband, Richard, was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't read. His wife had been publicly corrected, but she was also being offered an opportunity. The math of social dynamics was shifting in real time. I'll try, Mrs. Davidson said finally. I'll try to do better. That's all any of us can do. The meeting continued with discussion of practical details. The new ministry, which eventually became known as Grace Network, would operate on principles I outlined: dignity, conversation, partnership. Help would be offered without strings, but it would also be offered with respect, recognizing that everyone has a story more complicated than appearances suggest. I pledged the initial funding. Others stepped forward with smaller contributions. By the end of the meeting, we had $73,000 committed and a working group established to develop the structure. The drive home that evening was quiet. Chiamaka sat in the passenger seat of the 2009 Accord, processing what she'd witnessed. Mom, why did you let them think you were poor for so long? Because I wasn't harmed by their assumptions, and I wanted to see what would happen, whether anyone would ever ask me directly about my life. But it must have been frustrating, hearing people talk about you like you were a charity case. Sometimes, baby girl. But it was also educational. People tell you a lot about themselves by what they assume about others. Mrs. Davidson looked really embarrassed. She was, but she also learned something. Whether she changes because of it, that's up to her. Chiamaka was quiet for another mile. Dad would have liked what you did tonight, the way you handled it. The mention of Chukwuemeka caught me off guard, as it always did. You think so? He always said the best revenge was making people better instead of making them feel bad. That's what you did. You could have just humiliated her. Instead, you gave her a job. Your father was a wise man. I know. I miss him. I miss him too, baby girl. Every day. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Grace Network launched in January with Mrs. Davidson as coordinator. She proved surprisingly effective in the role. Humbled by the public correction, she approached the work with a humility that had been absent before. The first year, the network assisted 47 families with needs ranging from car repairs to medical bills to emergency housing. Every case began with conversation, with relationship, with respect. My anonymous giving continued, though it was no longer anonymous. I became known in the congregation as someone who gave generously but lived simply, an apparent contradiction that forced people to reconsider their assumptions about what wealth looked like. The real change was subtler. People started asking questions, not just about me, but about each other. The assumption that appearances told the whole story began to erode, replaced by curiosity about the lives beneath the surface. Mrs. Davidson and I developed an unlikely partnership. She remained prone to certain blind spots, but she was also genuinely committed to doing better. Our collaboration on Grace Network became a model for how the church approached community work. I still don't understand why you didn't just correct us from the beginning, she said one afternoon, months later. Why let it go on so long? Because telling you wouldn't have changed anything. Showing you changed everything. That's a long game. I'm a forensic accountant. I trace patterns over years, sometimes decades. Patience is literally my profession. The 15-year-old Accord finally died the following spring. The transmission gave out on Mission Road, leaving Chiamaka and me stranded until a tow truck arrived. The mechanic delivered the news that repairs would cost more than the car was worth. Time to let it go, Mom, Chiamaka said gently. She was right. But saying goodbye to that car? The last thing Chukwuemeka had touched before leaving for work on an ordinary Tuesday felt like closing a door I'd kept open for 9 years. I donated the car to Grace Network's vehicle program, where it was sold for parts. The money funded repairs for 3 other families' cars. The new car I bought was a used Subaru, sensible and practical, not flashy, not a statement, just transportation. Mrs. Davidson attended the vehicle donation ceremony. Full circle, she observed. The car that made us think you were struggling is now helping people who actually are. That's the thing about assumptions, I said. They're almost never completely wrong. I was struggling when I moved here, just not in the way you thought. What kind of struggling? Grief, loss, the work of rebuilding a life after everything you knew falls apart. The struggle wasn't financial, it was existential. Mrs. Davidson was quiet for a moment. I've never lost a spouse. I can't imagine. I hope you never have to. But if you do, I hope someone asks you how you're actually doing instead of assuming they know. The lesson of that congregation meeting stayed with me. In my professional work, I trace evidence, documents, transactions, the paper trail that reveals what actually happened beneath the surface of what people claim. The principle is the same in personal relationships. Appearances tell part of the story, but never the whole story. Grace Community Church learned to ask questions, to look beyond surfaces, to recognize that the person in the secondhand cardigan might be giving more than anyone imagined, and the person in the designer dress might be struggling in ways no one can see. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Assumptions still formed, judgments still occurred. But there was a new awareness, a willingness to check those assumptions before acting on them. 5 years after that congregational meeting, Grace Network had distributed over $400,000 in assistance to families throughout Traverse City. Mrs. Davidson had become genuinely transformed by the work, her earlier condescension replaced by a deeper understanding of how complex people's lives really were. My giving continued, though I never again sought anonymity. There was power in being visible, in demonstrating that generosity didn't require a particular appearance, that wealth didn't demand performance, that simple living could coexist with substantial giving. Chiamaka graduated from her academy with honors and was accepted to MIT. She wanted to be a civil engineer, building things that would last, structures that would serve communities for generations. Like what you've built at church, she said when explaining her choice, but with concrete instead of money. The last conversation I had with Mrs. Davidson before she moved to Florida to be near her grandchildren was characteristically direct. I think about that meeting all the time, she admitted. How wrong I was. How confident I was in my wrongness. We all make assumptions. The question is what we do when they're revealed. I try to ask questions now, before I decide I understand someone. That's all anyone can do. Ada, can I ask you something I've wondered about for years? Of course. If Pastor Williams hadn't found your donation records, if Operation Blessing had actually happened, what would you have done? I thought about the question carefully. I would have accepted the help graciously, let you give me the food and the clothing and whatever else you'd organized. And then I would have quietly donated triple the value back to the church anonymously to fund whatever came next. You would have let us help you even though you didn't need it? The impulse to help was genuine. I wouldn't have wanted to discourage that. I just would have redirected the resources where they could do more good. Mrs. Davidson shook her head slowly. You were always playing a longer game than the rest of us understood. I'm a forensic accountant. We think in years and decades, not days and weeks. Everything leaves a trail. Everything eventually becomes clear. The only question is whether we're paying enough attention to see it. They announced to the women's ministry that I was barely getting by. They planned food drives and clothing collections for the struggling single mother with the old car and secondhand clothes. They organized an entire intervention without ever asking me a single question about my actual life. But church walls are thin and voices carry, and some of us have been watching longer than others realize. I'm a forensic accountant. I trace the stories people tell through the evidence they leave behind. For 6 years, I traced the story this congregation told about me, the assumptions that assembled into certainty, the observations that hardened into facts, the charity that substituted for curiosity. The anonymous donor who gave $847,000 to Grace Community Church? That was me. The renovation of the community center? My gift. The scholarship fund, the food pantry, the sanctuary improvements, all funded by the woman they thought needed their help. But here's what I learned. The impulse to help wasn't wrong. The failure was in the assumptions, the certainty that appearances told the whole story, that an old car meant poverty, that secondhand clothes meant struggle, that a Black woman couldn't possibly be the one doing the giving. Grace Network serves hundreds of families now. Mrs. Davidson leads it with humility she didn't have before. The congregation asks questions instead of making assumptions. And I still drive a practical car, still shop at Goodwill, still dress in vintage finds that tell stories more interesting than anything new could offer. Because here's the thing about appearances. They're almost never completely wrong. But they're never the whole story either. The only way to know someone's truth is to ask. Nobody asked me for 6 years. Now everyone asks. That's the real change. Not the money, not the revelation, not the public correction. The change is a community that learned to be curious about each other instead of certain. And that's worth more than any donation I could ever make.